Long before Islam emerged, the Arabian Peninsula was a land shaped by extremes: extreme heat, extreme scarcity, and extreme social divisions. This vast desert region was not unified by a central government or legal system. Instead, it was ruled by tribal customs, oral traditions, and raw power. Survival depended on belonging. Without a tribe, a person had no protection, no identity, and no value. Mecca, though surrounded by harsh desert, held a unique position. It was a thriving commercial hub, strategically located along ancient trade routes connecting Africa, the Levant, and Asia. Caravans carrying spices, leather, gold, and textiles passed through its gates, enriching its ruling clans. At the center of Mecca stood the Kaaba, a sacred structure revered by Arab tribes. But by the early 7th century, the Kaaba was no longer a symbol of monotheistic worship. It housed hundreds of idols, each representing tribal gods, reinforcing a religious system deeply intertwined with economic profit and political dominance. Religion, commerce, and power were inseparable. A society built on hierarchy. Pre-Islamic Arabian society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top were the elite clans, wealthy merchants and tribal leaders who controlled trade, land, and religious authority. Beneath them were free tribesmen, artisans, and traders. And at the very bottom were slaves. Slavery was not merely an institution, it was an unquestioned norm. Slaves were acquired through war, debt, kidnapping, trade routes from Africa and beyond. They had no legal rights, no protection from abuse, no claim to family or dignity. Their lives were defined entirely by their owners. Among slaves, African slaves occupied the lowest social position. Their dark skin marked them as outsiders in an intensely tribal society that equated lineage with worth. This was the world into which Bilal ibn Rabah was born. The reality of slavery. Bilal's mother, Hamama, was an enslaved woman from Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. Historical accounts suggest she may have once been free before being captured and sold. Bilal inherited her status. From the moment of his birth, Bilal was not seen as a child, but as property. He belonged to Umayyah ibn Khalaf, a powerful Meccan aristocrat from the Quraysh tribe. Umayyah was not merely wealthy, he was influential, deeply invested in maintaining Mecca's social and religious order. For Umayyah, slaves were tools. Their pain was irrelevant. Their obedience was mandatory. Bilal's daily life consisted of exhausting labor, tending animals, performing domestic work, running errands under the scorching sun. Mistakes were punished harshly. Silence was enforced. Fear was constant. Yet early Islamic historians describe Bilal alayhi salam possessing a remarkable calmness. He was observant, reflective, and unusually composed for someone raised in brutality. At night, when the city quieted and the desert cooled, Bilal would gaze at the stars, vast, silent, unchanging, and he wondered. Spiritual emptiness of pre-Islamic Mecca. Despite its religious appearance, Meccan spirituality was hollow. Idols filled the Kaaba, but they offered no moral guidance. Rituals existed, but compassion did not. Charity was selective. Justice favored the powerful. Women could be inherited like property. Infant girls were sometimes buried alive. The poor had no recourse against the rich. Honor was measured by dominance. In this society, the idea that all humans were equal was unthinkable, and yet beneath the surface, dissatisfaction was growing. Some Meccans, known alayhi salam Hanifs, had begun questioning idol worship. They searched for the faith of Abraham, a belief in one God beyond tribal boundaries. Bilal, though enslaved and uneducated, felt this spiritual tension deeply. He did not know theology. He did not know scripture, but he sensed that cruelty could not be divine. The silence before the storm. History often changes quietly at first. Before revelations, before revolutions, before resistance, there is silence. Mecca continued its rituals. Caravans continued their trade. Slaves continued their suffering. No one noticed the enslaved African man whose heart was already preparing for transformation. No one imagined that the voice destined to echo across generations was currently silenced by chains. Bilal ibn Rabah was living in the shadows of history, but history was about to turn toward him, and the desert, which had witnessed centuries of oppression, was about to hear a message that would shake its foundations. In the early 7th century, Mecca stood at a crossroads, not geographically, but morally. Its markets were full, its caravans prosperous, and its elites powerful. Yet beneath the appearance of stability, Meccan society was spiritually fractured. Wealth had concentrated in the hands of a few clans, while the poor, the enslaved, and the weak remained invisible. It was during this period that a man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah began withdrawing from society. Known among the Quraysh al-Alamin, the trustworthy, Muhammad was respected for his honesty, even by those who would later oppose him. But he was deeply troubled by the moral decay he witnessed: exploitation of the poor, tribal arrogance, and a religious system that justified injustice. Seeking solitude, he would retreat to the cave of Hira, a small cave in the mountains overlooking Mecca. It was there, in the year 610 CE, that history shifted. The first revelation. According to Islamic historical sources, during one of these retreats, Muhammad experienced a profound and overwhelming encounter. An angel commanded him to read. Muhammad responded that he could not read. The command was repeated. What followed would become the opening verses of the Quran, a text that would transform not only Arabia, but the course of world history. The message was clear and revolutionary. God is one. God is the creator of all. Knowledge, justice, and moral responsibility are sacred. This was not a call to tribal loyalty or ethnic pride. It was a call to ethical monotheism. Muhammad returned home shaken, unsure of what he had experienced. His wife, Khadijah, was the first to believe in his message, affirming his character and supporting his mission. Islam did not begin as a movement of power. It began in fear, humility, and uncertainty, a message that challenged the system. As the revelations continued, the message of Islam became increasingly clear and increasingly dangerous to the Meccan elite. Islam rejected idol worship, tribal superiority, economic exploitation, social injustice. Instead, it promoted equality of all humans before God, accountability beyond tribal protection, care for the poor, orphans, and enslaved, moral restraint on wealth and power. For Mecca's ruling class, this was an existential threat. Their wealth depended on idol pilgrimage, their authority depended on hierarchy, their identity depended on lineage. Islam questioned all three.
The earliest followers. In its earliest phase, Islam spread quietly. There were no armies, no institutions, no political ambition, only individuals. Among the first followers were Khadijah, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Abu Bakr, Zayd ibn Haritha, and soon after, Islam reached those who had the least to lose and the most to gain: the poor, the marginalized, the enslaved. Islamic historians note a clear pattern. Those most oppressed by Meccan society were among the earliest to embrace Islam. This was not coincidence. Islam spoke directly to their lived reality. Bilal hears the message. Bilal ibn Rabah did not hear the Quran in a mosque. There were no mosques. He heard it in fragments, whispered conversations, stolen moments, secret gatherings. Words about one God reached him through the alleys of Mecca. Words about a God who sees all suffering, judges all equally, values faith over bloodline. For Bilal, these ideas were not abstract theology. They were liberation. Islam offered something he had never known: spiritual dignity. In a society that treated him as property, Islam addressed him as a soul. Why Islam appealed to the enslaved? Islam did not promise immediate political revolution. It promised something deeper: inner freedom, moral worth, divine justice. The Quran repeatedly condemned arrogance and praised humility. It reminded humans that wealth and status were temporary. For slaves like Bilal, this was not merely comforting, it was transformative. It meant their suffering had meaning. It meant their voices mattered to God. It meant their owners were not above accountability. Faith became a form of resistance, from private faith to public challenge. For the first 3 years, Muhammad preached Islam privately, but as the community grew, revelation commanded him to speak openly. When Islam entered the public sphere, opposition intensified rapidly. The Quraysh leaders mocked the message. They dismissed Muhammad as a poet, a madman, or a liar, but mockery soon turned to persecution. The elite realized that Islam was not fading, it was spreading, and it was spreading among those they had long ignored. Persecution begins. Muslims without tribal protection suffered first. The poor were beaten, the enslaved were tortured. Social pressure turned into physical violence. Islamic historical records describe Mecca during this period as a city divided, not by weapons, but by belief. Bilal, alayhi salam, an enslaved African with no tribal protection, stood at the most dangerous intersection. He had no shield, no clan, no safety. Yet the message of Islam had already taken root in his heart, and soon that faith would be tested in the harshest possible way. A faith that could not remain hidden. Bilal's acceptance of Islam was quiet, but not invisible. Slaves were closely watched. Deviation was punished. When Bilal's master, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, learned of his faith, the response was immediate and violent. For Umayyah, this was not merely disobedience. It was betrayal, a challenge to the social order, a threat to authority. a humiliation in front of other elites. Islam had crossed a line. The calm before the breaking point. Alayhi salam's persecution intensified. The early Muslim community grew stronger in resolve. They had little power, but unwavering conviction. They believed that truth was not measured by numbers or force. It was measured by sincerity. Bilal stood on the edge of a defining moment. The beliefs that had comforted him in secret would soon be tested under the open sun of the Meccan desert. History was no longer quiet. It was about to scream.
Persecution did not begin with mass executions or public trials. It began with something far more deliberate: humiliation. In Mecca, power was maintained not only through violence, but through public example. Those who challenged the social order were punished openly, turning their suffering into a warning for others. For enslaved Muslims, there was no refuge. Bilal ibn Rabah stood among the most vulnerable. He had no tribe to negotiate his safety, no family to ransom him, no social status to soften punishment. His body belonged entirely to his master, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, and Umayyah intended to break him. The mechanics of torture. Islamic historical sources describe Bilal's torture in stark detail. He was dragged from the city into the open desert at midday, when the sun was at its highest and the sand burned like fire. His clothes were stripped away, his back pressed against the ground. A massive stone was placed upon his chest, heavy enough to crush his breath. Dehydration followed, exposure followed, pain followed. This was not spontaneous cruelty, it was systematic. The purpose was not only to cause suffering, but to extract submission, a demand for renunciation. Umayyah and others stood above him, watching. Their command was simple: reject Muhammad, return to the gods of your fathers. In pre-Islamic Mecca, religion was flexible. Public conformity mattered more than private belief. Bilal could have ended his suffering with a lie. Many expected him to, but something had changed within him. The word that shook Mecca. Bilal's response was not a speech. It was not an argument. It was a single word: Ahad. One God, one truth. He repeated it, slowly, weakly, deliberately. Ahad, Ahad. Witnesses were stunned. This was not defiance through anger. It was resistance through conviction. Bilal's voice cracked under the weight of pain, but the word did not disappear. Why Ahad mattered. From a historical perspective, Bilal's choice of words was significant. He did not say Allah repeatedly. He said Ahad, a term emphasizing absolute oneness. This was a direct rejection of Mecca's entire religious economy. One God meant no tribal gods, no divine hierarchy, no spiritual monopoly. Bilal's word was theological and political. A former slave was denying the legitimacy of an entire system with one syllable. Crowds and silence. Alayhi salam Bilal's torture continued. Crowds gathered. Some watched with approval, others with discomfort, most with silence. No one intervened. Fear held them still. In Mecca, silence was a survival strategy, but silence also became complicity. Bilal lay exposed beneath the sun, surrounded by people who would later claim moral superiority. History would remember the man on the ground, not the men standing around him. Faith, alayhi salam, inner liberation. From a modern perspective, it may be difficult to understand why Bilal did not surrender. Islamic historians emphasize a crucial point. Bilal was no longer fighting for physical survival. He was defending meaning. Islam had reframed his suffering. Pain was no longer proof of worthlessness. It was evidence of commitment. Faith had transformed his identity from property into purpose. Psychological warfare. The torture did not end in a single day. It was repeated. Each session aimed to exhaust not just his body, but his will. Umayyah believed endurance would eventually collapse, but something unexpected happened. Bilal's calm unsettled his captors. His silence unnerved them. His repetition frustrated them. They were accustomed to screams, bargaining, tears. Bilal offered none of these, only Ahad. The spread of the story. Word of Bilal's resistance spread quietly through Mecca. Slaves whispered his name. The poor repeated his story. It became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of dignity. Islam was no longer an abstract belief. It was embodied. Bilal's suffering gave Islam a human face, the breaking point.
Eventually, even Umayyah grew frustrated. Public torture had failed to achieve its goal. Instead of submission, it produced something more dangerous: inspiration. Bilal had become a living contradiction, a man with no power, exercising absolute moral authority. Faith stronger than chains. From a historical lens, Bilal's resistance marked a turning point. It demonstrated that Islam was not sustained by comfort or reward. It survived pain. This challenged Meccan assumptions about control. If a slave could not be broken, what about free men? The question lingered. The endurance that changed history. Bilal did not know history would remember him. He did not know his voice would one day echo across continents. He only knew one thing: truth could not be negotiated. Under the crushing stone, beneath the burning sun, with death pressing on his chest, Bilal ibn Rabah chose oneness over survival, and in doing so, he became immortal.
By the mid-7th century, persecution in Mecca had reached a level that threatened the survival of the early Muslim community. Violence had become normalized, cruelty had become entertainment, and for those without tribal protection, suffering was relentless. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, Islam introduced a revolutionary principle: freedom, a moral obligation. For the early Muslims, faith was not confined to prayer or belief, it demanded action. Abu Bakr, a different kind of power. Among the earliest followers of Muhammad was Abu Bakr ibn Abi Quhafa, a respected merchant from the Quraysh. Abu Bakr was wealthy, but unlike many of Mecca's elite, he did not use wealth to dominate, he used it to liberate. Historical sources record that Abu Bakr spent a significant portion of his fortune purchasing the freedom of enslaved Muslims who were being tortured for their faith. Bilal ibn Rabah became the most well-known among them. The purchase of freedom. When Abu Bakr confronted Umayyah ibn Khalaf, the exchange was tense. Umayyah mocked him. Why waste money on a slave who will never benefit you? In Meccan logic, value was measured by utility. Abu Bakr's response rejected that worldview entirely. I did not buy him for myself. I bought him for God. With those words, a transaction took place that history would remember not as commerce, but as conscience. Chains were removed. Ownership was erased. A human being was restored. Freedom redefined. Bilal was now free, but Islam did not stop there. Freedom in Islam was not merely the absence of chains, it was the presence of dignity. Unlike other societies where freed slaves remained socially marginalized, Islam incorporated Bilal fully into the community. He ate with freemen, he prayed beside them, he stood shoulder to shoulder with them. This was not symbolic equality, it was lived reality. A new name, a new role. Bilal's identity transformed. No longer known as the slave of Umayyah, he became Bilal ibn Rabah, a man with lineage, history, and purpose. Islamic historians emphasize that the Prophet Muhammad intentionally elevated those who had been oppressed, not as an act of revenge, but as a correction of injustice. Bilal's strength was recognized, his character was trusted, his voice was valued. Community over hierarchy. The early Muslim community was small, but radical. There were no reserved seats, no inherited status, no racial hierarchy. Former slaves and wealthy merchants prayed together. This was deeply unsettling to Meccan norms. Islam was not just a new religion, it was a new social order. The psychological shift. For Bilal, freedom came with emotional complexity. Years of dehumanization do not disappear overnight, but Islam addressed this internal wound. The Quran spoke directly to the oppressed, promising justice beyond this world and accountability for the powerful. Bilal's worth was no longer defined by pain, but by faith, a voice prepared for history. It was during this period that the Prophet Muhammad recognized something extraordinary in Bilal. His voice, once silenced by chains, carried clarity and strength. In a society that valued poetry and oral tradition, a powerful voice was not merely practical, it was symbolic. Bilal's voice would soon serve a purpose greater than he could imagine. Freedom alayhi salam, a model. From a historical perspective, Bilal's emancipation set a precedent. Islam did not abolish slavery overnight, but it undermined it systematically.